be able to step back from the work and have this kind of experience of like almost eternity in that moment of doing it. So the slower I painted, the more methodically I painted, the more I felt some kind of, that invisible area within me was being, fed or nourished, by the practice. And then, going back to technology, this is interesting. Like it does seem like it hasn't become a full-blown art world trend or phenomenon necessarily, that like occult art is back or something like that.
Yeah.
Not that it ever was here, but
it was
occult
always
art
underground.
right. It's always been kind of at the edges.
Yeah.
But I do feel that more so in the last maybe 5 to 10 years or so, I have been seeing some inklings of art that is not quite figurative, not quite abstract. It's drawing upon either transcendentalist ideas, transcendentalist painting, or spiritualism or occultism, or there's, if not even that, if it's a little bit more kind of secular or empirical or something, maybe it's at least interested in the mind or the realm of dreams, as the Surrealists were. I've been seeing that emerging more and more in the art world. It's kind of interesting to me and maybe a relief to me in a way, because I've been sort of making that kind of work forever. And so it's like kind of vindicating. I'm like, oh, you see, my work has a context finally.
Right.
But yeah, no, that's kind of how it feels. But at the same time, I am wondering if, this is a kind of an indication of something that's happening on a larger scale in society. Maybe it's a side effect of global phenomenon that we've passed through, COVID, of course. There's been, terrible wars going on over the last few years. Or if it is a side effect somehow of technology, and how technology, especially information technology, has become more and more integral to our lives. It's also replaced a lot of things that happened in the kind of physical space, like we're talking on Zoom now,
right? Exactly.
sitting in a room together,
Exactly.
And one thing that I have thought is that, perhaps especially during COVID, as we've been living more in a kind of technological world, we are becoming less physical as beings. I know this might sound like I'm going out, but
no, not at all.
That in immaterial side of ourselves that kind of floats, the ghost that's in the shell, is activated a little bit more. Because we're existing so much in this kind of ethereal realm. I wonder if that's part of it. I don't know exactly, but
it could be a combination of all these things. And because I'm noticing exactly what you're noticing too, that there is some kind of shift happening. And I think there's so much instability in our sort of culture and our planet right now, especially depending on like what you have access to. I mean, I'm sure there are people who live in the middle of nowhere, who have no TV, who are doing just fine, listening to the birds and growing their food and just living off the grid and doing that. But like for a lot of us,
it's a very Western American centric perspective. I acknowledge that,
for sure. But it is the world that we, especially us, and probably a lot of whoever's listening to this, they probably have a phone or a computer,
Yes.
They have access to technology like that we're dealing with. And I think it's bringing up a lot of existential questions, especially in the face of like climate disasters that are happening, or in the face of what happened with COVID, or political upheaval and wars, and so to speak. Like people are turning within more, wanting to understand what's beyond all this craziness that obviously we have no control of. So I think that could be a part of it as well. I don't know. I find that there is more of a ripeness within culture to be more open to ideas that are that have been there for a long time, but have been sort of underground or taboo, especially with like psychedelics. You look at psychedelics that are being talked about on the mainstream news as being therapeutic. Like, hey, you're having a midlife crisis, go take a psilocybin journey, or whatever. Maybe not that like overt, but like I think you understand what I mean. It's like all these things are happening. And so I think it's a beautiful time of possibility. At least this is how I look at it in my mindset, is like, although there's so much suffering and difficulty and questions about the viability of our future, that within all of that, there is such immense possibility to maybe build something new. And I think what art can do is maybe help us ask these questions so we can dive deeper, or they can inspire us. It can inspire us to maybe like take a chance on a new idea, or explore a new feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it feels so interesting to me. Like I was aware of artists like Agnes Pelton and Hilma af Klint, like back when I was in college, but they, had not been exhibited very widely. Agnes Pelton was just kind of this, beautiful. And I love that their art has emerged into the mainstream, but I'm still kind of like amazed that it has, but those artists have now started to become, very central to a lot of contemporary art that I see, especially Hilma af Klint, I think.
Yeah.
Who's also been on my mind because I've been reading Julia Voss's biography. I'm like almost
cool.
finished with that.
I want to read
So
that.
it's
man.
excellent. She definitely does amazing research. But so I've been reading that. So I think that's kind of in my mind here. And there's a lot of reasons for these artists to be in the zeitgeist right now that I find, are equally important. It's not just all about occultism. It's a whole kind of revision of, the idea of modernism and women artists who had been excluded in the past, especially, Hilma af Klint, who's, going to the Academy of Arts at a time that's very, sexist towards women in the arts at that time. And then there's, the questions of early abstraction, so forth. And that's actually another thing that I find interesting is it's almost a reversal back to the original intentions of modernism and abstraction that I see with a lot of art today. If you look, and there's that Tate exhibit at the Tate in London that just happened recently, right? And it's af Klint and Mondrian. But, you can say Mondrian, you can look at Kandinsky, of course. A lot of these artists were reading theosophy. They were going to seances, August Strindberg,
mediums,
channeling, and it's almost as if the original intentions of modernism were to kind of open up human consciousness, were to kind of do away with these sort of definitions of forms and find these new abstract languages to kind of talk about the nature of reality. And maybe that, I'm just saying, like, that's one of the many reasons why artists like Agnes Pelton and Hilma af Klint and these artists who were kind of occult or too mystical early on to be in the history books have started to reemerge. It's because they're offering a new language and a way to kind of revisit that project of early abstraction again.
Yeah, because I feel like it got kind of hijacked by like a more of like a rationality of abstraction. I think of like Clement Greenberg and like the way that like modernist like painters were being sort of defined through just pure form and visual perception, but like kind of like didn't talk about all the other things that are behind perception, which is consciousness and this idea of like maybe potential other worlds or spaces where these things are coming through. I mean, you mentioned like even when you're painting, like you don't say it outright as like, channeling, but like you're trying to be a vessel for like some kind of energy beyond your own individuated ego to move through you to create something of value for others in like in that beautiful sort of sentiment way. I feel the same way. Like I don't know how to explain it, but like when you're in the states of flow, states of pure presence, where you're kind of emptying your whole vessel and just letting what's happening come through you, decisions are made like that, like intuition. A problem comes up, you just don't even think you solve it. You don't ruminate on it too much. I mean, there are times when I'm sitting there ruminating a long time about how do I solve it, but there are those magical times where it just seems like the painting just painted itself.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel that
Well,
way.
no, and that gets into like, another thing about early modernism is, another influence of mine and an art school of thought that I love in the early 20th century is Surrealism.
Mm-hmm.
And the Surrealists are all about these kinds of games for removing the self from the art, or they're practicing automatic drawing, sometimes seances outright, doing these kind of self-hypnosis or channelings. But the frustration I have with surrealism, and there were some critics at the time that kind of criticized this, like I think like Georges Bataille criticized this in Surrealism as well, the writer. But it's that the surrealists kind of like purged the mythos from that work, the mythological kind of Jungian archetypal element from it, and replaced it more with a kind of Freudian psychological interpretation.
Yes.
Which is, that's fine. That's one model of the universe
for sure,
that
right?
you can have.
I have my issues with Freudian analysis.
Yeah, it's reductive,
Exactly.
and a lot of his things have been criticized. A lot of his statements have been criticized. But like the surrealists, though, were tapping into something very true. Though they were getting into that mystical territory of allowing maybe another consciousness. And I can talk about like what I think about the idea of entities being channeled by artists as well, because I've written on mediumistic art and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I feel like the surrealists were doing that, but then also kind of putting up this wall of like, oh no, it's the subconscious, it's the material mind,
Yep. Trying to like not go there, because it's so hard to go there that they just write it off, or they just put it in this simple little box of the subconscious. Like, there you go. But like, that's why I love that you mentioned Carl Jung and Freud, because I always look at that like relationship and then that split between those two schools of thought, just to be a really fascinating point within Western culture.
Yeah.
Right. Like in terms of how the Freudian sort of ideas kind of took over, in most ways. I mean, of course you have the Jungian collective unconscious, the archetypes. We see that a lot in art and writing. We see it throughout time in mythology. I always love Joseph Campbell and his ability to kind of like look at mythology across the planet through the lens of Carl Jung. But when I think about my own experiences, mystical experiences, lucid dreams, psychedelics, deep states of meditation, or spontaneous just insights or spontaneous openings, or whatever, I don't know whatever you want to call it. They do speak to this like kind of universal space of, that could be like the collective unconscious, like where all of these or I think in Indian or Hindu culture, like the Akashic records, or the space where like all time is logged, all information, all ideas, everything that could ever be is like logged there. And like we can access those spaces too through altered states of consciousness. But I find that to be an interesting place.
Or like the idea of the pleroma in like Gnostic thought, that it's like this fullness of everything. And it's an interesting thing about Carl Jung also is that he was conflicted within himself. His writings that were published are bordering on the mystical, but they're still very couched in clinical psychology. And then you have like the Red Book, which is like personal visions, and it's
my wife
interesting.
Bought me the Red Book.
Amazing art also. I love his paintings.
Oh, dude, it's so cool.
Yeah. But, it's interesting that he has that conflict. I would say that, I am familiar with the idea of the Akashic record, and I find that interesting that there's this kind of universal ocean that we're all kind of droplets that have emerged from that universal ocean. And that's kind of why we have access to the completeness of all experience. And there is this kind of almost a kind of sense that sometimes, when you do encounter something in a work of art, you do sometimes, when it's happening right, there is this kind of feeling of almost like deja vu or familiarity.
Yes.
Even though you're seeing something new, you feel like you saw it already at some time. And I wonder if it isn't like some thing that like all these things have already happened in time.